So we've kind of called this series we're going through Holiness in the Midst of Hostility. And 1 Peter that we finished last week has really been about hostility to the church from outside the church. But Jude turns to another problem. Jude is concerned with hostility within the church. Jude is concerned that hostile forces have invaded the church. People who are claiming to be Christian, but who are teaching things that go against Jesus' teaching. You see, the devil has a two-pronged attack. If he can't get the church to crumble under external pressure, the fear of persecution and violence and death, if they are not enough to make a Christian renounce their faith and abandon Jesus and his church, if he can't do it that way, then he'll try to do it by getting Christians to abandon Jesus' teaching. He's like, sure, let them call themselves Christians as long as they're not actually following Jesus. Rob the church of life and power by having them follow their own ideas, their own desires, and their own passions. Get the church to follow false teaching and lead the people further and further away from Jesus until there's no truth left in the church and we are the church in name only. Peter said there is hostility outside the church, resist it. Jude says there is hostility in the church, fight it. It's active. So Peter says, just resist that what's outside, but inside the church we fight. We fight this false teaching. Before we get into all of that, a very quick introduction to the book of Jude. The first thing we notice about Jude is it's very short. There's no chapters, no chapter markings, just 25 verses. And it is indeed written by Jude. It says, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and the brother of James. Or if we had this in the original, it'd be, Judah, the brother of Jacob. And it's like the vaguest sort of introduction you could ever give. Because there were probably 1,000 Judahs, the brothers of Jacob, when this was written. But this is indeed Jude, the brother of the apostle James. So he is one of Jesus' brothers, one of Jesus' stepbrothers, a son of Joseph. Now, scholars kind of sort of spasmodically kind of like doubt whether Jude wrote this at all. And if you want to know why he did, we can talk about it, but let me encourage you this morning, there's no reason to doubt the tradition that the church has held to, that Jude wrote this, Jude the brother of James. The next question we might have is, why are we doing Jude now? Why in a series with 1 and 2 Peter, and why in the middle of 1 and 2 Peter? Well, simply because pretty much the entire text of Jude, certainly that middle bit, is incorporated into the letter of 2 Peter. So if you read Jude and you read 2 Peter chapter 2, it is pretty much a repeat of the letter. Why that is the case, we might get into when we come to 2 Peter, because it is interesting. It depends when we get there. We've got time to look at it, but that's why. And so it's one of the stranger things of the New Testament. But in itself tells us quite a lot about how the canon, this received book of texts, how it was put together. But based on that, based that Jude is in 2 Peter, we know that Jude's epistle was written first. And then it was incorporated into the text of 2 Peter. And so we're going to look at Jude first. And then when we get to 2 Peter, we'll do chapter 2 all in a one-er, and we'll expound on any extra bits that are kind of in there. So that's why we're doing it this way. Why is Jude writing his letter? Well, he says in verse 3, Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend to fight for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. So Jude starts his letter by saying, actually, this isn't the letter I wanted to write. I wanted to write something edifying and encouraging and instructive about our salvation that we share in together. But I can't, because there's a problem and we can't ignore it. Some heresy, some false teaching has come into the church. And so Jude says, contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. He says there is this faith that was delivered to you. It was deposited here in the church, and it made you a community, a family. And that deposit was meant to be once and for all. It was given to you. You were supposed to maintain that faith and preserve that faith. But something has happened, and you are in danger of losing what was delivered to you. And that is why Jude is writing, to encourage them to fight back against those who are questioning the gospel and drawing the church away from the true faith. Verse 4, for certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, what I'm saying now, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. So it's not that these people were saved and have kind of drifted and, no, that these guys started out bad. They're up to no good. They've crept in. And while we don't get a lot of detail exactly about what they are teaching, we are told that they've changed the grace of God into sensuality. And that word here really means kind of lewdness or rudeness or licentiousness. Basically, behavior that is sexual and uncontrolled, out of bounds. They are exchanging what God is wanting to do in the community of the church, making it a community of love and compassion, a community of priests that is holy, and instead they are using it for their own pleasure, their own lewdness. They are making the kingdom of God into a kingdom of man. And the problem with this is not just, that they are breaking some moral code. It's not a case of, well, we're Christians and we have some rules. No, it's much more serious than that. Because by doing this, they are rejecting what God is doing in the community, in the church. And instead, they are trying to please themselves and their own appetites. They are denying God. Morals are doctrine lived out. Morals are doctrine lived out. Morality is not something different to theology. It is doctrine lived out. It is faith. It is faithfulness. They denied God with the way that they lived. What you do with your body is not some secondary issue, disconnected to what you believe. One influences the other. And so Jude begins to lay out his warning, verse 5. He says, now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Jude is making 2 points here. First, there is one faith, and that faith has always been about Jesus. We sang it, didn't we? It's all about Jesus. It hasn't changed. Jesus hasn't changed. And so this faith that was delivered to you hasn't changed. And secondly, there have always been those who walked away from the faith, and it has always ended the same way for them. And so in verses 5 to 7, he gives 3 examples of that happening. So Jude is saying these people have come in and they would have you believe that things have changed. Oh, no, you can be a Christian and still do this. whatever it may be. Oh, that rule, that was just cultural. Well, that's the Old Testament. This is the New Testament. Oh, the Old Testament God was an angry God. But Jesus, he's just chill. Have you heard these sorts of things? And Jude says, I want to remind you that Jesus saved the people out of Egypt. Jesus is the Lord of the Old Testament. There is one faith. Those who change that faith end up the same. There is the same faith and the same fate for those who do not believe the one faith. Christians sometimes talk about God too much. What I mean by that is that we don't articulate and specify the person of the Trinity whom we are talking about. But Jude doesn't make this mistake. No, he pins it down. It wasn't just God who saved the people out of Egypt. It was this person, Jesus, the God-man, the Son of God. We read it earlier in our service, didn't we? There was a point when Moses is told that God is going to send this particular angel to lead them out of Egypt and through the wilderness and into the promised land. And he says, this angel is not just any angel, this messenger, this one sent from God. It's not just anyone sent from God, because this one has my name in him. And so actually one of the things he has authority to do is punish all your sins. And God says, obey what he says, as if it was my word, because it is. And he's referred to as the angel of the Lord. We see him appear several times in the Old Testament. It's funny though, isn't it? Because what does John say in his gospel? He says, no one has ever seen God. And then Jesus says it, no one has ever seen the Father. And then Moses, when he asks to see the Lord, what does the Lord say? You cannot see my face, you shall not see me and live. And yet, there are all these times when people do meet with God, and they do see him. And every time that happens, that is Jesus. Jesus, we saw in Colossians recently, didn't we? Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He has always been. And so it was Jesus who walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. It was Jesus who sat down and ate a meal with Abraham. It was Jesus who came to Hagar in the wilderness. It was Jesus who spoke to Moses from the burning bush and met with him daily in the tent of meeting. It was Jesus who wrestled with Jacob. It was Jesus who stood with Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace. And it was Jesus who was the one in the midst of that fiery, cloudy pillar that led Israel out of Egypt. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. It's always been him. And we can so easily flatten out the Trinity with talk of God. But Jude reminds us that our faith is in Jesus. It has always been Jesus who has redeemed his people. This Jesus who turned up in Bethlehem as a baby, who healed the sick and fed the hungry, died on a cross and rose again. This Jesus is not some new revelation of God. He's not someone different or softer than the God of the Old Testament. He is the God of the Old Testament. The true faith hasn't changed. It has always been Jesus. It was Jesus then, and it is Jesus now. And so, those who reject him today can expect the same fate as those who rejected him then. Jude says, Jesus, who saved the people out of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. The point Jude is making is that Jesus who brought you here and made you a church is the same Jesus who brought Israel together and made them a nation. And yet after he'd done that, there were some in Israel who grumbled and complained and wanted to do things their own way. And they never made it to the promised land. They were destroyed. And so Jude is holding out the same possibility to us. You made a good start. You received the faith that was delivered to you. But if you don't hold fast to it, if you don't protect it, if you don't defend it, you can end up just like them. Or, he gives another example. You could end up like the angels in verse 6. These angels who did not stay within their position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. He has kept them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. It's another example. The fallen angels are evil, not in their origin. They were made by God to be good servants. The fallen angels are not evil in their origin, but in their failure to hold to their origin. These angels started off as angels serving God on the divine council. It started off so well for them, but they didn't hold on to what they had, and they went astray. And how does it end up for them? In chains. And just as an important aside, what Jude is referring to here, because strictly speaking, there is no place in the Old Testament that outlines angels leaving their proper dwelling. Well, like Peter, like we saw in Peter previously, Jude is referencing the book of Enoch and the story of the Watchers. This same thing that Moses refers to in Genesis 6 with the Nephilim. It's all the same thing. And Jude is going to quote the book of Enoch even more explicitly in the second half of his letter. So it's very clear that this is on his mind as he's writing, which is actually not very surprising to us, is it? Because as we saw before, Enoch was a very popular book and widely read in the early church. And you'll remember in the book of Enoch, and as we see in Genesis 6 as well, the way in which those angels fell was through some sort of lust for human women. So again, there's this idea of lewdness and this denial of God. And then Jude gives us a third example. So Israel abandoning who got destroyed, the angels, and now a third one which confirms this pattern of going against God in a lewd way, with pairings that were not natural, were against God. Verse 7. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. If you're familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, angels were sent by God to save the family of this guy called Lot. He's part of Abraham's family. And the men of the city try to rape the angels. And the result is that God wipes out both cities and all the surrounding cities. And so what we see is that part of the issue, not the whole issue, but the final issue, was that the men of Sodom went against God by lusting with an unnatural desire. This angel desire. And so Jude uses all three of these examples to say, look, no matter how well you start, if you neglect what was entrusted to you and start to follow these false teachings and these false moralities, then destruction can happen to you. Because, verse 8, in like manner, in the same way, these people who have come into the church are relying on their dreams, and they defile the flesh, they reject authority, and they blaspheme the glorious ones. That is what these people are doing in the church. They're dreaming up their own ideas. They're following their own passions of the flesh, defiling their body, defiling the body of others, and they're doing it all while rejecting Jesus' authority that is put in the church. And in so doing, they blaspheme Jesus and his holy angels. How should we be then? Well, Jude offers a counter-example, a positive example in verse 9. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Jesus, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Okay? So here in church are these men who are presuming to judge God, who are blaspheming Jesus. But Michael, this like top tier angel, when he was having to deal with the devil, like the worst person ever, even he didn't take it upon himself to curse the devil. The archangel was like, it's not my place. I know my place. It's not my place to rebuke the devil. He had more respect for the devil than these men had for Jesus. And yet they presumed to teach in the church. Now, notice, because this is important for us, Jude refers to this event with Moses' body in the same way that he refers to Jesus leading Israel, the angels falling, and the account of Sodom and Gomorrah. He treats them in the same way. He mentions them all in the same way. But you will not find this account anywhere in the Old Testament. He is quoting one of these, what we might call, apocryphal texts. Now, we've talked about this before, haven't we? And it's worth repeating. Because we might have all sorts of kind of hang-ups or knee-jerk reactions at even the mention of texts outside the 66 books of the Bible. But the point is, the biblical authors didn't have those hang-ups. And neither did Jesus, who also referenced these writings. But, in referencing them, Peter, Paul, James, Jude, they are not saying that this writing should really be a part of the Old Testament. They're not saying that. But for them, they didn't have this idea of canon in the way we often do. We so often think that in church, in sermons, in spiritual conversations, we must only ever reference the 66 books and nothing else. I mean, obviously, apart from commentaries and podcasts and blogs and study guides and what Dave down the street thinks, yeah? We believe we can get all the spiritual help from these modern extra-biblical sources, but just not the ancient ones. And I think that's something I'd really love us to overcome a little bit. Jude and Jesus didn't see it that way. Writings didn't have to be in the Old Testament to be true or insightful or helpful. And so this is what it was like to be a Christian in the first century. There wasn't a New Testament, was there? It was still being written, and there wouldn't be a formalized New Testament for a few hundred years. And so you had the Torah, and you had some other stuff. And depending where you were, that list of stuff you had would be slightly different. And yeah, every now and again, you get a letter from an apostle, or that was maybe not directly from the apostle, but from the church you received it, and you'd make a copy, and you slide it in with all the other stuff. Hello, little Wren. That was lovely. You'd slide that in with all the other scriptures. But you would receive these writings as a part of this kind of whole tradition that was handed down to them. So everything from kind of being told by, your rabbi or your pastor or whoever it may be, like, this is how to do your daily prayers. This is how to interpret the scriptures. Is all part of one big tradition. And they would quote it all in the same way. So that bit we're going to read later on in our service when we come to communion, that bit when Paul quotes about a rock following Israel in the wilderness. And he doesn't say, well, guys, I know it's not in the Torah, but I have it on good authority from, this rabbi who taught me this is how it worked. No, he just cites it. He just says, you know the rock that followed Israel in the desert, because it's tradition, and everyone knew it. The important thing for us, I think, is that they weren't just handed a Bible and told, don't read anything else, don't listen to anyone else, just read it for yourself and come to your own conclusions. We know, don't we, that's a really dangerous way of reading the Bible. No, there was this larger tradition. There was the church, the ancient church, that helped them to understand the scripture. And so we here see Jude leaning on this tradition. Jude obviously expects that the church has this event kind of to reference easily. He's just like, just like with the Exodus, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, that time with the devil and Moses' body. So about that incident, at the end of Deuteronomy, there is this reference that God buried the body of Moses. He covered it. Yeah, and it just kind of disappears. And in Deuteronomy it says, and to this day we don't know where it is. And that's all it says in the Old Testament. But what we get in these other writings, which don't disagree with the Bible, is that there is this story of how Moses' body was taken up to heaven. So Moses kind of has this early resurrection. Now, it's not like Enoch and Elijah. We know those prophets, don't we? They didn't even die. They get taken straight up to heaven in their bodies to the heavenly council. Moses does die, but then he's sort of resurrected. It's called the Assumption of Moses, the taking of Moses. And we could dismiss this idea, and many do. But it's actually a tradition that's already endorsed in the New Testament at the Transfiguration. So you remember, I don't know how long ago, we did the Transfiguration in Luke's Gospel. And there's this bit when Jesus goes up a mountain, he takes a few of his disciples with him, and who does he meet? Elijah and Moses, the law and the prophets. Now, it makes sense why Elijah has a body and is stood there, right? Because he didn't die. He went straight up to heaven. But Moses does too. He's not just a spirit, he's a person, because he's been resurrected and taken up to heaven. Anyway, that's what this fight was about, over Moses' body. Why were they having a fight over Moses' body? Well, modern thinking is very influenced by Plato. We just can't help. We can't help ourselves. That's the way we think, the way we've been taught to think, and we're probably not going to get away from it anytime soon. But we make a very strong distinction between the body and the soul. That's very Platonic. And we think of our soul as living in our body. Like our body's like this meat machine that our soul drives around. And so at a funeral, you might hear someone say something like, they're not here anymore. They've gone. This is just a shell. But that's not how the ancient Christians thought about bodies. It's not a biblical idea. We are an animated body. That just really means an ensouled body. The word anima coming from the Latin for soul. We are our bodies. You are your body. Which is why the resurrection is such a big deal. Because you get brought back to life again. You get resurrected. And it's why death is so devastating. Because at death, our body, which is us, and our soul, which is us, is torn apart. It's a big deal. It's pulled out of our body. And because our body has no life in it, no soul, it is subject to decay. But decay isn't a biological idea. It's not like, well, now the spiritual bit's gone, we're just this body. Decay is spiritual. Decay happens because of the devil, because of sin. And so when Adam and Eve sin, that is when they are told, dust you are, and to dust you will return. That's because of sin. Sin taints our flesh, not just our soul, it taints our body. And what was Satan told on that same day? You're going to crawl on your belly, and you're going to eat dust, right? Now, ancient people weren't stupid. They didn't think that snakes ate dust. No, it's that Satan was the one who his job was, we thought about this, didn't we, at Easter? His job was to consume the dead. He was to make them into dust. The dead go to him. That's why we see in a lot of kind of Christian iconography, a lot of Christian art, the entrance of Hades so often looks like the mouth of a serpent. So, the idea is that Moses dies and the devil, chomp, 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 comes to receive his body and decay it and turn it into dust, to corrupt it. But because Moses is righteous, Michael comes to defend his body, say, no, you don't get this one. You don't get this one. He's coming with me. He's coming up to heaven. He's going to be resurrected and he's going to sit with Jesus on the council. He's going to be one of Jesus' servants, one of the angels. And Jude says, if Michael can show that much respect, as it were, to even the devil, how can these men act in this way that is so disrespectful and rejecting of Jesus. He says in verse 10, they blaspheme what they do not understand. He says they speak freely about things they know nothing about, and they behave like animals, believing that all the things they can see, that's all that matters. That, the flesh and the world and food, and that's all that matters, and they disregard the deep mysteries of heaven and of angels and of Jesus and of the sacraments, and they can only understand things that they can deal with their flesh, and that leads them astray. And yet they speak out on such things with authority. And then Jude fires off 3 more Old Testament examples. He says, woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. Notice, Jude doesn't say they are like these people. He says they are joining in. They are participating in the same sins. They walked with them. They abandoned. They perished. Cain, of course, killed his brother. But he was particularly significant in early Christianity, not only as the first sinner, but also as a teacher of sin. He is seen as the first heretic. It's through his line that the Nephilim are made and come, through his line. Balaam, of course, he sought to make money from God's people. He was happy to destroy them for the right price. And then in Korah's rebellion, Korah and his 249 associates believed in a sort of democratic church structure where everyone stands equal and nobody needs a mediator. They were like, we don't need a priest. We don't need a pastor. Each can decide for themselves what is true. This was Korah's rebellion. And this was the rebellion that was happening in the church that Jude was writing to. And what happens with the sons of Korah? Well, they end up having the ground open up and swallow them down. They went down to Hades, alive, body and soul. And so these are the kind of people who these people in the church are being compared to by Jude. They are heretics who are out to get what they can, even at the destruction of God's people, and they reject the authority of the church. Now, we need to stop there, not because it's an ideal place to stop, just because there's too much here for one sermon. So we're going to round up some of this, and then we'll get more to the application next week. But just briefly, what is Jude's big point in this first half? We can sum it up in 3 words. It's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. It really is all about Jesus. Jude refers to a lot of stories, but 2 of them stand out for being similar and yet opposite. On the one hand, we have Moses, who is body and soul in heaven, who doesn't wait till Judgment Day and is resurrected straight to heaven. And then we have the sons of Korah, who go straight to Hades, body and soul. Do you see that? What's the difference between these 2? Moses followed Jesus. Not perfectly, but Moses followed Jesus. The sons of Korah followed themselves. Jude tells us to beware of those people in church who seem so self-confident about spiritual matters and yet who produce no spiritual fruit and who care so little about holiness. If we want to be filled with life, if we want our lives to make sense, if we want our world to be ordered, if we want the deep mysteries of the cosmos to be revealed to us, we need to follow Jesus. He is the only one who saves. We can be so tempted to follow our own flesh, to go with what is comfortable, to follow voices and leaders who tell us that we can have what we desire and still be Christians. But where are these people leading us? There is only one leader of the people of God. There's only one leader of the church, and that is the angel of the Lord. That is Yahweh. That is Jesus. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Let us follow him together. All glory be to Jesus. Amen.